I had spent weeks planning the ceremony, down to the last rose petal and the exact shade of my dress. At 55, I wanted this vow renewal to be perfect. Not merely a reenactment of our wedding day, but a testament to 3 decades of shared laughter, tears, trials, and triumphs. Friends and family were gathered in the sunlight-dappled courtyard of the old manor house where we had first exchanged rings. White chairs lined the manicured lawn, their ribbons fluttering in a gentle breeze. The air smelled of jasmine and freshly cut grass. My 2 daughters stood by my side, their faces glowing with pride. My heart felt light. I could almost hear the notes of our original wedding song, a lilting piano melody, drifting through the open windows of the hall behind me. Then he arrived. Not alone. This was the moment I had imagined 1,000 times. His confident stride toward me, his eyes soft with affection. But reality diverged from fantasy in the most devastating way. He stepped through the wrought iron gates, hand in hand with a woman at least half my age. She looked stunning in pale blue silk, her hair cascading perfectly over one shoulder, her heels clicking on the cobblestones with theatrical precision. My breath caught in my throat. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath with me. My husband, walking beside his supposed mistress, wore a tight smile, the kind that strains at the edges and reveals everything you wish remained hidden. He reached the front of the aisle, offered me a polite nod, and paused. The murmurs started low, rippling through the guests like the first startled notes of a discordant song. I watched my children's faces blanch as they recognized the stranger beside their father. My closest friends exchanged glances. Shock, confusion, concern. I stood serene, my posture regal, my expression calm. Inside, however, a storm of questions roared. How long? How many times? How could he choose humiliation as his gift to me on this day? The officiant, a kindly minister who had known us for years, opened his mouth to speak customary words of blessing but faltered when he noticed the interloper clutching my husband's arm. I raised a hand to forestall him. Please, I said softly but firmly, let us proceed. I have always believed that dignity is the last refuge of a woman who has been wronged. So I allowed the ceremony to begin even as my gaze never left theirs. My husband spoke of love's enduring flame, his voice trembling with feigned earnestness as he recited vows we both knew by heart. But then he paused, glanced at the young woman and added with forced bravado, "This time I speak for both of us." A gasp rolled through the assembly. My husband's mistress, or whatever title she claimed, smiled, a pained, rehearsed curve of her lips. The minister searched for his place in the script, but the ritual faltered like a wounded bird attempting flight. When he finally presented me with my ring, a simple band of gold we had chosen together all those years ago, I took it from him, my fingers brushing his, the brief contact electric with silent accusation. I held up the ring, its surface catching the sunlight, and addressed the crowd in a voice that betrayed none of the turmoil within me. This ring once symbolized our union, I said, and today it stands for something far more potent. I turned slightly and offered the ring to the young woman by his side. A collective intake of breath echoed around me as she stared in astonishment. Please, I continued, accept it. Wear it as you see fit. The envelope in my other hand trembled only slightly as I extended it toward her. I had signed the divorce papers early that morning, long before any of our guests arrived. They lay within that white envelope, sealed and ready to dissolve the marriage he had so recklessly betrayed. Her eyes flickered between the ring and the envelope and I saw recognition dawn. She was a pawn in a game that she had perhaps not fully understood. Now she held proof of my resolve. I stepped back, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Silence enveloped the courtyard, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves overhead. The minister closed his book with a soft thud, as though startled awake from a dream. My daughters covered their mouths with trembling hands. My friends looked on, unable to reconcile the scene with the love story they had come to celebrate. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, to explain, to plead, but I raised a hand again, this time in farewell. Turning on my heel, I walked down the aisle alone, the soft gravel crunching beneath my heels. Every eye followed me. I felt neither shame nor sorrow, only the quiet peace of a woman reclaiming her power. Behind me, I heard the crunch of her heels and his nervous footsteps, but I did not look back. I resolved then that my future would not be defined by his betrayal but by the strength I carried within me. And as I reached the courtyard gates, I stepped through into the sunlight, leaving whispers and stunned faces behind. In that moment I knew the Real journey was just beginning. I walked away from the courtyard without looking back, my heels clicking on the gravel as if marking the end of an era. The sunlight felt warm on my shoulders, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe deeply, as though inhaling the promise of freedom. My daughters had vanished into the shadows of the guests, their faces hidden behind trembling hands. I did not gather them, I did not acknowledge them. I kept moving until the sound of conversation and stifled sobs faded behind me, replaced by the hum of the garden's bird life and the rustle of breezy leaves overhead. Each step forward felt like stepping out of a cage I had built around my heart long ago. By the time I reached the stone bench beneath the ancient oak at the edge of the property, my mind had cleared of anguish. I sat down and rested my hands on the hem of my dress, feeling the soft fabric against my skin. The ring and the envelope containing our signed divorce papers lay untouched in the pocket of my clutch. I closed my eyes, recalling the moment I handed that symbol of 50 years of promises to the other woman. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. At 55, after 30 years of marriage, I knew exactly what I deserved: respect, honesty, and a love that didn't waver the moment a younger smile appeared. The memory was punctuated by the distant echo of my husband's tentative footsteps. He called my name, his voice rough with emotion, but I remained silent. When he reached the bench, he stood a few feet away, uncertain. His mistress, pale and shaken, hovered beside him. I felt no triumph in the sight of their confusion. Rather, I felt pity, for him, for her, and for the life I once thought we shared. Finally, he broke the silence with a single question: why? I looked at him with nothing but calm resolve. Because I choose myself, I said. I choose my dignity over your deceit. I stood, smoothing my dress, and left him standing there as helpless and exposed as I had felt moments before. From the oak tree, I walked toward the gatehouse where I kept my vintage bicycle. It was a relic from our early days together, bright blue with a wicker basket I once packed with picnic sandwiches. It had gone unused for years, gathering dust beside old gardening tools. I unlocked it and swung my leg over the saddle. The basket still held a faded ribbon from my wedding bouquet. I gently lifted the ribbon and tied it around the handlebars, as though ceremonially reclaiming a piece of my past. Then I pedaled away down the winding drive, each push forward an assertion that my life was not over. It had simply taken a different route. The village beyond the manor was quiet on a late summer afternoon. Locals paused on their walks to greet me, unaware of the upheaval inside me. Some recognized me, a few offered sympathetic smiles. I returned their nods with a grace that surprised even me. My daughters appeared at the edge of my vision, riding their own bicycles in tandem with mine, their wheels keeping pace. I slowed, waiting for them to catch up, but they did not speak. Instead, they reached out and slipped their small hands into mine. Their touch grounded me in a way I had forgotten was possible. We rode in silence until we reached our family home, an ivy-clad townhouse on a narrow cobblestone street. At the front door, I paused and looked back at the quiet road. The manor's gates were not visible from here, but in my mind I could still see the stunned faces of our guests and the misaligned trio standing beneath the arch. I drew a deep breath and turned the key in our home's lock. Inside, it smelled of lavender and old books, comforting and familiar. I set my bicycle aside, closed the door gently, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. My daughters waited for me in the hallway. Their eyes shone with tears and questions. I knelt and gathered them into an embrace, letting them cry into my arms. They clung to me as if I were the only safe place left in the world. I stroked their hair, whispering, "It's going to be okay," though I did not yet know if it would be. But the words felt necessary to say. After a while, when the tremors of shock had subsided, I led them into the living room. I brewed tea and set out a plate of shortbread cookies, our family's favorite. We sat on the well-worn sofa, watching the teacups steam in our laps. My younger daughter, her voice trembling, asked, "What will happen to Papa?" My older daughter's brow furrowed as she added, "Are we going to move away? What about school?" I looked at each of them, their faces so young and trusting, and I felt a pang of guilt that their childhood had been upended. Yet I also felt a fierce protectiveness rising within me. I forced a small smile. "Your father and I are choosing different paths. You will stay here in this home where you have friends and memories. I promise you nothing else will change unless you want it to." They exchanged glances, uncertain but nodded. The calmness in my tone seemed to soothe them more than any grand gesture could. That night, after I tucked them into bed and their soft breathing filled the darkened house, I sat at the dining table with a single lamp casting a pool of light over the blank pages of a journal. I opened it and wrote, "Today I reclaimed my life." I described every emotion I had felt, from the shock in the courtyard to the resolve beneath the oak, from the pedal strokes down the road to the tearful embrace in the hallway. I detailed how it felt to be both betrayed and liberated in the same breath. Writing felt like therapy, each word loosening knots in my chest. When I finally closed the journal, I felt a quiet weariness but also a budding sense of possibility. Over the next few days, I began to rebuild the structure of my life. I consulted a trusted attorney to confirm the divorce filings I had already initiated. I sorted through my wardrobe, setting aside the dresses I had worn for family gatherings and selecting a few new pieces, simple, classic, and reflective of the woman I was becoming. I met my best friend, Carla, for coffee at the little cafe down the street. We laughed and cried in turns as I recounted the Vow Renewal catastrophe. She squeezed my hand and said, "You handled it with grace. You taught him a lesson he'll never forget." Her words buoyed me, though I knew the real strength came from within. I also met with my older daughter's school counselor to discuss any support she might need during the transition. Practical matters, I discovered, were as important as emotional ones. Yet amidst all this, a question lingered. What did I truly want for my future? I closed my eyes and visualized possibilities: travel, volunteer work, perhaps even writing a memoir. I felt the stirrings of ambition I had set aside in the comfort of marriage. I realized that after 30 years of playing roles, wife, mother, hostess, I had lost sight of who I was when I stood alone. Now I would rediscover that woman. And as I drifted to sleep that night, the final thought in my mind was not of anger or betrayal, but of promise. This new chapter of my life would be one I wrote entirely on my own terms. When dawn broke the next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose humming through my veins. The previous nights of reflection had given way to resolve. I would no longer drift between obligations and old habits. I dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored navy slacks, clothes I hadn't worn since my corporate days, and stood in front of the mirror. I studied the woman looking back at me, hair streaked with silver, eyes bright with determination, posture straight and unyielding. For 30 years I had subordinated my ambitions to family life. Now it was time to reclaim my identity. I grabbed my leather satchel, slipped in my laptop and a stack of resumes, and headed out to the community center where I had signed up to teach a weekend writing workshop. The center was a modest brick building at the edge of town, its windows displaying flyers for yoga classes, chess clubs, and art exhibitions. I greeted the receptionist, a young woman named Jenna, who looked at me with polite curiosity. "You're here for the memoir workshop?" she asked, scanning her computer. I nodded and signed in. In the waiting area, a few participants sipped coffee and leafed through notebooks. The instructor's table held name tags, pens, and fresh mugs of tea. When the clock struck 10, I stood and introduced myself to the group. "I'm Margaret," I said, using the name I had always used in professional settings. "Today we'll explore telling our stories with honesty and craft." As the session unfolded, I guided writers through prompts, listened to their readings, and offered gentle feedback. Each time someone connected with their own voice, I felt a spark of joy, a reminder of the passion I'd abandoned. After the workshop, several attendees lingered to thank me. One woman, perhaps in her 40s, said, "You have a real gift for encouraging others." I smiled and replied, "Thank you. I've spent years listening to other voices. It's time I honored my own." Her appreciation buoyed me, as though she'd validated my decision to step into this role. In the parking lot, I unlocked my bicycle and rode home, pedaling past the old manor gates that still carried ghosts of yesterday's ceremony. I felt neither bitterness nor nostalgia. Instead, I felt a quiet assurance that my life's trajectory was shifting toward something meaningful and self-chosen. At home, my daughters waited in the kitchen unpacking groceries. Their questions tumbled out. "How was your class? Did they like you?" I ruffled the younger one's hair and unpacked a carton of eggs. "They were wonderful. I think I'll teach again next month." My older daughter watched me with admiration in her eyes, the familiar pride I thought I'd lost. Over lunch, we planned our weekend. The older one would practice piano, the younger would invite a friend over, and I would prepare for another workshop. It was an ordinary conversation, but ordinary felt miraculous after the upheaval of the vow renewal debacle. That afternoon, the mailman delivered an envelope embossed with the crest of my former husband's law firm. My heart twinged with caution as I slid it open. Inside, I found a neatly typed letter confirming receipt of my divorce papers and stipulating a mediation date in 3 weeks. There was no mention of alimony, property division, or parenting time. Those details would be hashed out later. I tucked the letter into my satchel and exhaled. The legal process stretched before me like an uncharted river, but for the first time it no longer intimidated me. I was fully prepared to navigate it. Later, I visited Carla, my best friend since college, at her home in the Old Mill District. The loft's high ceilings and exposed brick walls felt vibrant with creativity. She poured me a glass of red wine and we sat on worn leather chairs, toasting to new beginnings. Carla had reinvented herself as a graphic designer after her divorce 5 years earlier. She spoke of freelance contracts, design competitions, and deadlines, her eyes alight with the thrill of creation. "You should illustrate your memoir," she suggested. "Combine your words with images. People love that." I laughed at the idea, but something about it excited me. "Maybe I will," I said. "Maybe I'll surprise everyone, including myself." On my way home, I stopped by the town library to investigate volunteer opportunities. The librarian, Mrs. Evans, greeted me warmly and pointed me toward a bulletin board where charities posted requests. One flyer sought tutors for adult English learners. Another called for mentors for at-risk youth. I snapped photos with my phone, contemplating both roles. I had always believed that education could transform lives as it had mine. As I left, Mrs. Evans called after me, "We'd love to have you here, Margaret." Her use of my professional name felt fitting. A reminder that I was no longer just a wife or mother but a resource and a guide in my own right. That evening, I sat at my desk and drafted an outline for my memoir. Chapters tracing childhood summers, early career triumphs, the whirlwind of young love, and the steady years of domestic life. I reserved a section for the vow renewal catastrophe, not as a moment of defeat but as a turning point. I felt a thrill in my fingertips as I typed the chapter headings. Roots, bloom, storm, rebirth. The words felt true, resonant with the journey I was undertaking. Before bed, I checked on my daughters. They were reading quietly in their room, the lamp casting soft halos around their books. I kissed their foreheads and whispered promises of stability and warmth. As I descended the stairs, I paused in the hallway, listening to the gentle hush of the house. For the first time in years, the silence felt full of possibility rather than burdened by expectation. I realized that my life was evolving, from a blueprint laid out by others to a canvas awaiting my brushstrokes. Lying in bed, I reflected on the day's successes and uncertainties. I felt gratitude for the writing workshop, for Carla's encouragement, for the library's welcome, and for the steady presence of my daughters. I also felt anticipation for the mediation, a formal step toward closure but also a gateway to fresh starts. Sleep came easily, and in my dreams I saw myself standing in a meadow bathed in morning light, pen in hand, ready to write the next chapter. When I awoke, I would continue that work. Each word, each decision, an affirmation that this life was mine to shape, one deliberate stroke at a time. When the morning of the mediation arrived, the sky was overcast, as though nature itself sensed the gravity of what lay ahead. I slipped into my navy pantsuit, elegant, authoritative, and free of frills, then glanced at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman who stared back seemed unrecognizable from the startled spouse I had once been. Her posture was upright, her gaze steady. Today, I would negotiate not only the terms of our separation but also the final contours of my independence. The law firm's marble lobby was hushed, its polished surfaces reflecting soft light from tall windows. My ex-husband's attorneys led us through corridors lined with abstract paintings and into a conference room centered by a long mahogany table. I took my seat opposite him. He looked tired, lines etched around his eyes and mouth deepened by guilt or regret, I could not tell which. The mediator, a calm woman named Diane, offered a brief introduction to the process and distributed copies of the proposed settlement agreement. I scanned the document. Division of property, custody arrangements, spousal support, legal fees. Each line represented a piece of my former life. My heart pounded, but I reminded myself of the promise I had made, to choose dignity over despair. I cleared my throat and began. I'm grateful for your time today, I said, my voice steady. I've reviewed these terms and I propose a revision in Section 3 regarding temporary alimony. 30 years of marriage contributed to my fiscal stability, and I require an adjustment for the next 12 months to re-establish myself. The mediator nodded and my husband's lawyer furrowed his brow. He countered with a lower figure, citing my ability to secure teaching gigs and freelance writing work. I acknowledged their point but stood firm. I appreciate that perspective, but transition periods exist for exactly this reason. 30 years is not negligible. Negotiations unfolded in a series of offers and counteroffers. I focused on essentials: adequate financial support, clear custody schedules, and the house I had made into our family's sanctuary remaining in my control. We also discussed our daughter's well-being, joint decision-making for education and health care, with me as primary residential parent. My ex-husband fidgeted as we detailed holiday schedules and visitation arrangements. I watched him struggle between the desire to preserve his privileges and the stark reality of his choices. Finally, after more than 3 hours, we reached a tentative agreement. Diane summarized the key points: a 6-month alimony plan, sole ownership of the townhouse, shared parenting responsibilities, and a commitment from both parties to respect each other's privacy. I exhaled. The relief that surged through me was tempered by the knowledge that paperwork and signatures were merely formalities. Emotional repercussions would reverberate for months to come. Yet in that moment I felt powerful. Not because I had won every concession, but because I had asserted my worth on terms that honored my contributions. My ex-husband looked at me, eyes shadowed. "I'm sorry," he murmured. I met his gaze for an instant before I turned away, unwilling to grant him further access to my vulnerabilities. That afternoon I returned home to find my daughters sprawled on the living room rug, immersed in a board game. They looked up as I entered, smiles breaking across their faces. In that simple greeting, "Mom, you look tired, let us help," I recognized the true stakes of the mediation. This was not merely a legal proceeding. It was an affirmation of the family unit I intentionally preserved. We ordered pizza for dinner and ate at the kitchen table, talking about school, friends, and the upcoming art exhibit at the community center. Ordinary conversation was its own kind of triumph. Over the next few days I tackled logistical tasks with newfound resolve. I updated my address at the bank, changed passwords on joint accounts, and contacted our utility companies to transfer service. Each administrative chore felt like pulling root balls of the past from my life. I donated old wedding photos to be digitized by a friend who curated family archives. I boxed up and used china and silverware, symbols of the marriage I had once cherished but now released. I labeled each box with neat handwriting: donation, single women's shelter, community center kitchen, family friends if desired. My daughters helped, giggling as they found a tea set with their tiny fingerprints pressed into the glaze. Amidst the paperwork and packing, I carved out time for myself. Each morning I walked through the park near our home, breathing deeply and watching squirrels dart haphazardly across the lawn. I let sunlight warm my face and listened to the steady rhythm of my footsteps. The past months had felt like a whirlwind. These walks rooted me in the present. I brought a leather-bound notebook with me and wrote down fragments of thoughts, ideas for a chapter on forgiveness, lines inspired by the oak tree that had witnessed my transformation, reflections on the meaning of partnership and autonomy. One crisp morning I encountered a man sketching benches by the pond. He looked up and smiled politely. "May I share this path?" he asked. I nodded and we strolled side by side, admiring the play of light on the water. He introduced himself as Daniel, an architect researching public spaces for accessibility improvements. Our conversation flowed easily. He spoke of design principles, I described the benefits of creative writing for mental health. Before parting ways, he asked if he might join me for coffee at the park cafe on Saturday. I hesitated. Social encounters had felt foreign since the Vow Renewal debacle, but something about his genuine interest encouraged me to say yes. "I'd like that," I replied. He offered his card and I slipped it into my notebook. On Saturday, over lattes and blueberry muffins, Daniel and I discovered a mutual love for history and storytelling. He spoke of his grandmother's wartime letters. I recounted reading diaries from my childhood. He listened with rapt attention, his eyes reflecting kindness rather than judgment. I learned that he volunteered as a literacy tutor for refugees, and I felt a spark of admiration. When he asked about my memoir plan, I found myself sharing chapter titles and themes. His enthusiasm was sincere. Your story deserves an audience. People will be moved by your resilience. His encouragement felt like a gentle breeze lifting my sails. The afternoon sunlight grew golden, and Daniel suggested we visit a nearby art installation, sculptures of metal ribbons twisting into abstract shapes. I agreed, and together we wandered between the pieces, discussing interpretation and emotional resonance. At one point he paused at a sculpture that resembled a ribbon unfurling. "It reminds me of renewal," he said softly. I looked at him, surprised at the resonance. "I feel that way too," I admitted. In that moment I sensed the fragile stir of new companionship, one untainted by betrayal, built instead on mutual respect and shared curiosity. When I returned home that evening, I found my daughters fast asleep in bed. I sat in the hallway watching their peaceful faces and felt gratitude for the transitions I had engineered. A fair mediation agreement, the release of material ties, small seeds of friendship growing. I realized that this phase of life was not a detour but a reorientation. I was charting a course not dictated by wedding vows or social expectations but by the quiet compass of my own heart. As I closed the door behind me and slipped into my study, I noticed the envelope with the finalized settlement agreement resting on my desk. I opened it, confirming the mediator's signature and the terms we had negotiated. I placed it in a file labeled Final, then stood and stretched, feeling the tension of months dissipate. I walked to the window and gazed at the street lamps flickering on as dusk settled. Down below, a family walked past, the children's laughter echoing in the cooling air. I whispered to myself, "This is the life I choose." The words felt like a vow, not to another person but to myself. Around me, the world was settling into night, and I perceived not darkness but the promise of renewal. The next chapter would bring its own challenges. Managing new relationships, growing my writing platform, supporting my daughters through the emotional ripples of divorce. But I felt ready. With each decision I made, I reclaimed a piece of myself lost during 3 decades of marriage. And as I turned away from the window to prepare for sleep, I knew that the story yet to come would reveal how far I had truly traveled, and who I would become when the final page turned. When the spring sun warmed the courtyard of the old manor once more, I returned, not as a supplicant, but as an architect of my own destiny. It had been 2 months since the mediation, and in that time I had cultivated alliances and gathered evidence. Each legal document, recorded conversation, and clandestine photograph had been laid out in neat files on my desk, the sum total of decades of devotion and betrayal. Today I would use them. I arrived just before noon, dressed in a charcoal sheath dress that spoke of quiet authority. My heels clicked confidently on the gravel as I passed through the gates, startling the groundskeeper who bowed politely. The manor's facade was unchanged. Its ivy still clung to the stone, its windows still gleamed in the sunlight, but inside, everything had shifted. My ex-husband believed the property transferred to me as per our agreement, leaving him free to publicize his engagement to the young woman he fancied. He had arranged a luncheon in the grand dining hall to announce his new fiancée to the same circle of friends and family who had witnessed our vow renewal catastrophe. He expected triumph, he did not expect reckoning. I entered the dining hall through the servants' passage, where I had once slipped in unnoticed as a nervous bride. Now I was no longer nervous. I paused for a moment at the side door, listening to the low hum of conversation, the hushed gasps, the tinkling silverware, the rustle of silk gowns. I straightened my shoulders and strode in, carrying a single leather portfolio. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. My ex-husband froze mid-gesture, a carving knife poised above a roasted lamb. The woman at his side paled, her laughter dying on her lips. "Please," I said, my voice calm, "I have something I'd like to share." I laid the portfolio on the table and opened it with deliberate slowness. Inside were photographs of bank statements showing transfers from our joint account to a shell company in her name, letters bearing her signature acknowledging promises of a future together, and most damningly a recording of their discussion, in his own voice, about how to conceal the affair's finances. The hush deepened until it was nearly palpable. My ex-husband's lawyer, invited as a courtesy, rose with a stiff cough. He cleared his throat, preparing to interject, but I raised my hand, forestalling him. I won't need your assistance, I said. I looked directly at my ex-husband. You stand here claiming love, promising a future with her, yet you arranged for every expense of this liaison to be borne by assets we share equally. I held up the recording device. This is your voice, admitting that you intended to divert funds from our marital estate to support your betrayal. His face drained of color. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between my ex-husband's ashen face and the young woman who had sat so primly beside him. She tried to smile, but it lacked warmth. I continued, you believed that signing divorce papers and transferring the home to me would silence any recourse. But I have not been idle. I stood and walked the length of the table, allowing every witness to see the documents. I submitted these to my attorney last week. I filed a petition to recover misappropriated marital assets and to seek punitive damages for financial deception. Gasps rippled through the hall. I closed the portfolio and laid my hand on the table. You gambled that your betrayal would remain hidden, that you could build a new life at my expense. You were wrong. My voice was firm but not cruel. It carried the weight of someone who had endured heartbreak yet refused to be diminished by it. I turned to the guests. I apologize for the disruption, I said, but I believe honesty is the only honor left in a room built on falsehoods. Then with a quiet nod I walked away, leaving stunned faces in my wake and the rustle of whispered speculation trailing behind me. Outside the courtyard was serene. I inhaled the scent of lilacs blooming against the stone wall. My heart pounded with residual adrenaline, but more than that I felt a deep satisfaction. Justice had an echo and today I had made it resonate. As I crossed the lawn, I spotted my daughters waiting by the fountain, their eyes wide with awe. My younger daughter ran to me, throwing her arms around my waist. "Mom," she whispered, "that was incredible." My older daughter touched my hand gently. "You showed them what strength looks like." I kissed their foreheads, feeling both their pride and their relief. They had witnessed more than a mother's revenge. They had witnessed a woman's reclamation of her power. In the weeks that followed, news of the luncheon fallout spread through our community. Articles in the local paper praised my courage. Social media buzzed with admiration for the woman who handed her husband his comeuppance. My name became associated with integrity and resilience rather than mere victimhood. Legally, my petition led to a settlement that restored the diverted funds to our joint estate, and the punitive award bolstered my new ventures, paying off lingering debts, funding a writing retreat I had dreamed of, and ensuring my daughter's financial security. Yet revenge, I discovered, was not the end, it was a catalyst. On the day the settlement was final, I hosted a private reading at the community center. The room was filled with faces I respected, friends, neighbors, former students. I read a passage from my memoir's final chapter, a section I titled Phoenix Rising, where I reflected on betrayal, justice, and the alchemy of turning pain into purpose. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine. I realized then that the greatest revenge was not in humiliating another, but in rising above betrayal with grace and forging a future that no one could undermine. That evening, I walked home under a sky streaked with pink and gold. My daughters skipped ahead, their laughter echoing down the cobblestone street. I paused at the gate to our townhouse and felt a profound gratitude, for the wounds that taught me vigilance, for the courtroom that taught me conviction, and for the manor courtyard that hosted both my humiliation and my triumph. I unlocked the door, and as I stepped inside, I whispered to the empty hallway, "This life is mine." No further vows were needed. I had proven that even the fiercest betrayal could become the foundation of an unbowed, unbroken life.